My name is Duncan, and I am an elder here at Central. I did not know that once you come off a session that you continue being an elder forever, kind of like being a judge, but I will accept that. Glad to see so many of you all here. When they asked me to speak over Labor Day weekend, I assumed it was because there wouldn't be a lot of people here and their exposure was limited, but apparently you guys decided to skip the beach. Thank you for that. But in the spirit of Labor Day, what we're going to talk about today is this concept of work and how work aligns with our worship. If you're like me and how I spent most of my life, I kind of had my secular work life over here and my church life over here. And the only time they really intersected was when I was applying for a job and on my knees praying that God would grant me this job. But I tried to keep them separate as far away as possible. But as I got older and smarter, wiser, I realized that God really doesn't distinguish between what we would consider our secular space from our worship, but that in His economy, it's one and all the same. So God doesn't distinguish what I do every day at BGE versus Pastor John, who is here in full-time ministry. Work is intrinsic one way or another. To take it even further than that, God doesn't distinguish with what you do every day from the Apostle Paul, who we're going to read about later. I mean, when you think about Paul, and in the letter we're going to read, Colossians, I don't believe, I could be wrong, but I don't believe Paul realized that 2,000 years later, the letter he's writing to a small church that people in Baltimore, Maryland would be reading and growing and learning from. So we never really know where our calling may lead. But when we start to look at the fact that work and worship should be one and the same, and they should not be two separate events, it causes me to wonder why so many of us are disengaged with our work. So when I first got asked to do this sermon, I was really going from an angle of evangelism and how we can work and we can evangelize those that work with us. But as I was working on a separate project, I realized that many of us are disengaged. The Gallup survey, folks that you've all heard of, has said that 51% of American workers are disengaged with their work. 51%. Then on top of that, 17% are actively disengaged. Those are what I call the cave dwellers because they're consistently against virtually everything, actively disengaged with their work. And if we say our work is worship, how then can we be so disengaged? And what we're going to do is I come up with the handful of reasons that we'll kind of look at today. I'm sure there are many more. But we're going to start by reading. We're going to turn to the book of Colossians, chapter 3, and then verse 23 through 25. I'm sorry, 22 through 25. So Colossians 22 starts, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it, not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism." I want to read 23, 24 one more time. "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving." So I think the first reason that many of us are so disengaged with our work is because we forget who we're working for. We think we're working for our boss. We think we're working for our paycheck. And that means when you have a great boss like me, I can say that. I can say that with 100% confidence because as I look out here, no one that works for me is in here. But that means typically whether you have that great boss or whether you have that not so great boss, you still have to work diligently. The other thing we need to keep in mind is who God is. God is a worker. The very first sentence in the Bible, the very first sentence says God created. He started working. And so if we're made in the image of God and God is a worker, then we can put it together that our work must have some intrinsic value. He goes on in Psalms 139:13, the psalmist talks about being created in my inmost being, knit me together in my mother's womb. Think about it. God could have made us all the same. The beauty that we see across the earth, in the cosmos, in the heavens, and stars, God created all of that. But look around you. Everyone is different. Now I'm going to take a little liberty here and to try to put myself into heaven in a conversation that I presume might go on in heaven. I've never been to heaven, so I don't know what they talk about in heaven, but I'm just going to, say this, that the Father talking to the Son as they were creating me, and I believe that he looked down and he said, look at that head. That head is so beautiful that we should avoid covering it up with hair. Workmanship, perfection, that is God. But knowing then that God is a worker, knowing that, how then do we respond? And I think the first way to respond to that is to work diligently. I struggle with people on my team in particular that claim Christ, that claim Christianity and are lazy, because it's just not consistent with who God is. So I think the first thing we have to do is we have to work diligently. Tim Keller said the very first way to be sure you are serving God in your work is to be competent. I recently heard John MacArthur kind of give an analogy, and he said that, when you reach the top, when you reach the point that you have no more to give, when you reach your ceiling, that's God's floor. And I didn't really get that until I stumbled upon another verse. I'm going to take you all the way back to Exodus, and this verse right here, these verses blew my mind. I've been reading the Bible my entire life and never, ever came upon these verses, mostly because I struggle reading the Old Testament, but it tends not to hold my attention as well. But again, I'm struggling. It's a journey, right? But finding this, so it's Exodus 31, 1 through 5. Then the Lord said to Moses, see, I have chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God. That's the key. And I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills to make artistic designs for work in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, and to engage in all kinds of crafts. There it is. There it is. If you want to be a better worker, there it is. Know who the source of your power is, and it's the Holy Spirit. It's the Holy Spirit is the source of how you can become a more diligent worker. And I feel like that's going to be many of our greatest regret when we get to heaven, is that we did not tap into that power more. It's almost like living in a house and being in a house and living for decades in a home and living like you're in the 1800s, walking around with no electronics, walking around with no lights, and you're holding a candle to get from room to room. And then right as you're moving out of the house, somebody comes in and flips the switch. Like, why didn't you just turn the light on? You had access to this power the whole time you've been here, and you chose to live in the dark. And I believe that's going to be a regret for many of us. Now, again, I tell you, I'm on a journey. I haven't always been there. And when it comes to this concept of working diligently, I'm embarrassed to share this, and I'm going to tell you, you won't find it anywhere on my LinkedIn profile. But my very first job out of college, I'll never forget, my boss called me in, and he said, Chris, you are the only person I know that works hard at not working hard, then works even harder telling everyone how hard you work. That hurt, but not instantly. Because if you knew me in my 20s, you would know humble wasn't a word that you would use to describe me. So when he initially said it, I actually thought he was working towards a compliment. And it wasn't until I started to notice the strange look on his face when I started to smile and I realized, wait a minute, I'm not interpreting what he's saying right. So I get it. So the first thing I think is to work diligently. I think the second thing we have to do, knowing that we're working for God, is working with a high level of integrity. And I don't need to spend lots of time on this because I think you get it. Operating integrity means don't steal company supplies, even if you think they won't miss it. And if you ever find yourself going to grab something and saying, they'll never miss this, they will. Operate with integrity. Don't call in sick when you're not sick. I can't say it any more than that. When you do that, you're not operating in integrity. You're not, I feel like when you get to that point, you're forgetting about who exactly it is that you're working for. Another reason I think we're so engaged is because we spend so much time comparing ourselves to others. We spend so much time looking over our neighbor's fence, seeing what our neighbor has. When we're at work, we're looking at the office across from us. We're looking at the next cubicle, and we're trying to figure out why this person got promoted, why that person, why didn't I get promoted? I deserve to get promoted. And I'm going to, again, be honest. Whenever anybody gets promoted at my company, I always feel like it should have been me. It doesn't even matter if it's in my department or if I have the skill set required for the job. I always feel like I should have gotten promoted before that other person. But what we do, though, when we have our eyes focused so much on other people, when we're so caught up in what our neighbors have and what our neighbor is getting, what our colleagues at work are getting, we're taking our eyes off of the source. We're taking our eyes off of the one that we're ultimately working for. And it begs the question, do you really want what you deserve from God? Do you really want what you deserve? So stop comparing. It's challenging though, right? Comparison is challenging now more than ever because of things like social media. I can remember exactly last summer, 2017, my family, my siblings, my parents, a bunch of us, probably 12, 13 of us all, took a vacation down to Myrtle Beach. 2 people had enjoyed that trip, those 2 little kids sitting right there, because they were with Nana and Pawpaw, and they got to do whatever they wanted to do, whenever they wanted to do. I'm not going to say it was a horrible trip, but I'm only not going to say it because I don't know if my mother may end up hearing about this. But it was quite bad. However, if you looked at my sister and her daughter, my niece's Instagram or Facebook post, you would have thought we had the best trip ever. It rained practically every hour of every day. But the second that sun came out, they were out on the beach taking pictures and doing the pouty face, which I still never have gotten that pouty face when you're taking selfies. It bothers me. But they were out there constantly. And if you would have looked at their Instagram page, if you would have looked at their Facebook pages, you would have thought we had the greatest trip ever. I find myself doing that all the time. I compare myself to my friends. How do they have this? Why do they have that big house and I have the townhouse? Constantly. But again, when we start comparing, we're taking our eyes off of God. Another thing that I believe is that we get to the point that we don't expect trouble. Now, I tell people I loved the 7th grade. It was my favorite grade of all, from kindergarten up through my master's degree. 7th grade was my favorite. Miss Runkle. She's the only teacher I can remember her name from all of those years. But I had to move on beyond 7th grade, right? And I feel like for many of us, we have not moved on from a very elementary belief and faith. We believe that once we become saved, once we find Christ, that life is going to be easy and that we're not going to have problems. This book is full of people who knew Christ and were full of problems. As a matter of fact, all the way back to the garden. See, the concept of work was there before the fall. Work was to be with God. However, after the fall, God told that work is going to be hard now. So when we have that elementary viewpoint, we get shocked. We get upset when work becomes hard. However, go back to Colossians. Who did he address that to? The section that we read was addressed to who? Slaves. On your worst day, you're better off than a slave. On your worst day. Only when it comes close are moms and dads that work from home. I did that one day, and I can tell you it was hard. But on your worst day, though, you're better off than a slave. So you should expect to have a bad boss. You should expect troubles to come. However, and here's the key, when those things happen, we have the secret. We have a secret of being content even when you have a difficult job. There's a secret of being content even when you have a difficult boss. And we're going to take a look at it real quick. I think it's one of the most misunderstood verses in the Bible. It's in Philippians 4:10 through 13. And again, here Paul is writing, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. So when we think about verse 13, I can do all this through him that gives me strength, I know I misapplied that verse all the time. I know whenever I'd go for a job interview, I'd sit there and I can do this because God's going to give me strength. But I always forgot what Paul was saying before that when he says, every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. So it's not about being able to run a marathon. So last year I ran the Baltimore Marathon, and at the starting line, I'm all about I can do this through Christ. Christ is going to give me strength. I can do this up until about mile 17. And then I found another verse that I cling to. It was, be still and know that I am God. But we need to understand this verse, though, that the secret to contentment is understanding that God has given us every single thing we need. It's not about how big the bank account is. It's not about the title. It's not about where you work or who you work for. It's not about your education. It's about learning to be content because you have been given everything you need. This is not a promise that all your dreams are going to come true. But it is a promise when your dreams fall apart, you don't have to. When your dreams fall apart, you don't have to because you have been given everything you need to survive.